The Google software engineer behind this controversial 10-page memo is gone after blasting diversity and women in the workplace. A source at Google tells CNN that he is no longer listed in an online company directory. Multiple news outlets have just been flat out saying he's been fired. This guy argued that women are inherently less suited for tech jobs than men for a host of biological and psychological reasons.
This is someone who came out with a letter, essentially denigrating, a large population that he worked with, right? Sort of saying that, hey, you're all my colleagues, but, you're not as good as sort of your other colleagues for some of the reasons that he outlined in the memo.
A gentleman went out of his way to say, hey, women shouldn't be represented as much as they are in tech, and distributed it amongst everyone at Google, I guess.
This guy linked me, this dude who was fired from Google because of his 10-page manifesto about how women aren't represented so much in computer engineering and all that sort of stuff because they are biologically less able to do that stuff. But the fact that his thing said that women and men are biologically different, therefore women aren't as good at computers.
Conservative at Google writes sexist manifesto demanding end to inclusion of women and people of color. Who's getting fired?
What? Oh my gosh. I don't think any of these people read the memo. Ladies and gentlemen, it's P-Dog Night.
Go! 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 Bow to your sensei!
Hello Internet, this is P-Dog Night, and this is the first in a series of videos about the now famous Google Memo. Yes, the same memo that former Google engineer James Damore got fired for. Now, I've been listening to so many people talk about this thing, and it's amazing how few people who criticize the memo talk about what the memo actually says. In fact, it seems like most of the critics talk more about things it doesn't say than what's actually in the document. It's almost like people talking about it are playing a game of Chinese whispers, or telephone as we say in the States. You know that game they do in grade school where they'll take a room full of kids and line them up, and then you whisper something to the first kid, something like, dogs like dog food, and you only say it once, and then that kid gets one chance to whisper what they heard to the kid next to them, and then that kid might not hear it right, but they still have to whisper it to the next kid, and you keep going on down the line until you get to the last kid. And then the teacher asks the last kid, what was the message? And the last kid says something like, Stephen Colbert has a BMW and a pet duck. How the hell did you get that? And this is how news reports and conversations about the Google Memo have gone over the past couple months. It's amazing to me how many people talk about this damn thing and just seem to have no idea what it actually says, because what they're saying has no correlation to the actual words in the memo itself. Now, I first heard about this thing on Twitter the same day the text of the document was published by Gizmodo, and it was presented as a 10-page anti-diversity screed, and some people were calling it a manifesto. So when I heard the words anti-diversity and screed, I got this vision in my mind of what an anti-diversity screed or manifesto would sound like. I'm expecting this to be some guy saying that women suck at this and women shouldn't be engineers, and we don't need blacks and Mexicans because only white and of course Asian computer guys can really do this stuff. That's what I was expecting to read, and I'm thinking, I gotta see this because it's gotta be awful. So I click on the article, and Gizmodo had removed all the links and sources the guy included, but whatever. They still had the full text, so I read that even without the sources. And I read the entire memo, not just the summary at the beginning. And when I got done with it, I was like, holy crap, why are they calling this an anti-diversity memo? Because one of the stated purposes in the memo was just the opposite of how Gizmodo described it. Because if you really read this thing, James Damore was actually discussing ways for Google to improve their diversity initiatives so they could find ways to increase the number of women who would want to work in Google's computer engineering department, because he thinks that's important. And he even makes suggestions in the memo on how to do that. So my first question after reading the entire memo was, why would an anti-diversity memo be making suggestions on how to increase the number of women in computer engineering? This doesn't make any sense. But the answer to that was simple. It is not an anti-diversity memo. And then my second question, and maybe the more obvious one, was Why are people losing their mind about this memo? Because it pissed off a lot of people. And that, well, here's what I think. First, because James Damore brings up the very touchy subject of biological differences between men and women, which he says in part may account for some of the disparity in the numbers of men versus women choosing computer engineering as a career. And that is really what got people riled up, because a lot of people interpreted this as him saying that men were more capable than women in these jobs because of biology. And that's not what he was saying at all. And we'll get into that later. But the second reason people were mad, which is related to that, is due to this giant game of Chinese whispers that people have been playing with the reporting of this document. Because remember, the first time anyone heard about this outside of Google was either through an article in the tech website Motherboard, which called it an anti-diversity manifesto, or the Gizmodo article, which called it an anti-diversity screed. So if you've ever heard of the term poisoning the well, this is a classic case. Poisoning the well is a rhetorical technique and logical fallacy that uses the association of negative emotions to distract a subject from the actual evidence in an argument. It can be done subtly or it can be quite blatant. A subtle way of poisoning the well would be to use particular adjectives in introducing something that would influence people who are about to hear, or in this case, read an argument. Damore's document was introduced to the general public as anti-diversity, a manifesto, a screed. Clearly, these words used in combination are going to elicit a strong emotional reaction before you even read the first word of the document. I mean, anti-diversity? Clearly anyone in this day and age who is anti-diversity is an awful person, right? I mean, come on, if you're anti-diversity, you're a bigot, sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, anti-immigrant son of a bitch who hates babies and puppies. That's just how it is. Clearly this document was written by a Nazi, am I right? And how about manifesto? Well, technically a manifesto is just a public declaration of intentions or motives, but calling the Google Memo an anti-diversity manifesto, that's not meant to be a positive thing. I mean, you know who else wrote manifestos? The Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh, and the Communist. Although some people might think the Communist was a good thing. Oh, I know. You know who else wrote a manifesto? Adolf Hitler. He called it Mein Kampf. This Google thing has gotta be bad. And finally, the word screed. And this is the one that actually makes me laugh, because a screed is a long, boring speech or piece of writing with a bad attitude, like a rant. If you've had enough and you're not going to take it anymore, you go ahead and write an angry screed. You can also call a screed a harangue or a tirade. Now, the reason this is funny to me is because although the Google Memo is kind of long and some might think it's a bit boring, it doesn't come even close to sounding angry, and it actually reads like an academic project. Damore uses very measured language, he provides footnotes, and the original version, which came out the day after the Gizmodo article, you can see all the citations and links he provided to support his claims. This is not just some guy pounding out an angry blog post or YouTube video. Now, there are other ways the well got poisoning regarding this thing. Much of the reporting on Damore's memo did not focus on the document as a whole, but rather certain words or phrases in the document that could be misinterpreted on their own, but when read in context have a completely different meaning. For example, in the document, Damore prefaces his discussion on some of the specific average differences between men and women with this:
I'm not saying that all men differ from women in the following ways, or that these differences are just. I'm simply stating that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership. Many of these differences are small, and there's significant overlap between men and women, so you can't say anything about an individual given these population-level distributions.
So that's what it says in the document. How did ABC World News Tonight present that information?
That the abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership.
Did you catch that? Did you see what ABC did there? Damore was talking about how the different distribution of preferences and abilities between men and women, which has significant overlap, may cause men and women to make different choices. That's the main point of the entire document. ABC presented it as
that the abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership.
So if you only heard the ABC News version of what Damore said in that paragraph, well, of course you'd be mad. I would be too, because out of context, it sounds really bad. In fact, BBC and many other outlets cherry-picked the same quote, as well as many other words or phrases completely out of context to try to paint the memo in the worst light possible. So I imagine if you were predisposed to assume that all disparities between men and women in the workplace or society were due to some patriarchal system designed to keep women down, and then you hear or read about some guy on the internet saying that women were biologically inferior to men, and that's why they aren't suitable for tech jobs, even if you decided to read the Google memo, you would have such a bias toward it that giving it a fair reading would be very difficult to do, because you'd be reading it with some preconceived notion of what it was about, while also dealing with your own personal biases. So I absolutely understand why even people who decided to actually read James Damore's document might not at first be able to give it a fair reading. So it would be difficult for them to come to the same conclusion as I did, that it is not an anti-diversity screed that was being presented in the media. I mean, think about all those statements you heard in the introduction to this video, and I encourage you to go back and watch the beginning of this again. James Damore doesn't say or even imply any of those things in his memo, and yet notice how with each new person talking about it, the story changes just a little bit. It's almost like a game of Chinese whispers. So, here's my challenge to you before you watch my next video on this. Go and read the entire Google memo, whether you've already read it or not. I've put a link to the complete version with all the sources and footnotes in the description down below. But before you do, I want you to forget everything you've heard about it, whether it was from news reports or internet articles or your friends on Facebook, and especially on Twitter. I mean, Twitter is just a 140-character game of Chinese whispers on steroids. And if that's where you heard about it, I'm guessing that 98% of the people who tweet about it never read it and only know about it based on what someone else said about it, and the only links that those people provided were another person who wrote something that they already agreed with. Again, Chinese whispers. Go read the memo for yourself using what is known as benevolent or charitable reading. Now, there's a YouTuber known as Dr. LAYMAN, and he's put out a great video on how to deal with bias in research, which I've also linked below. And I really suggest you watch the whole thing. I think it's really good. But here's the part about benevolent reading that I'm asking you to use when you go back and read the document.
Let's start with benevolent reading. Effort-wise, this is the easiest measure to attempt, but it can be mentally exhausting and hard to keep up. What you do is that you use the strongest possible interpretation for opposing arguments. For example, you want to research Marxism. Sure, you could jump in and tear apart every single word of every single sentence and get completely absorbed in Karl Marx's obviously wrong understanding of knighthood as shown in his Communist Manifesto, or you take a deep breath, apply benevolent reading, understand that some of the details of his work were a result of the time, and instead focus on getting the strongest possible argument for a Marxist worldview.
So let's apply Dr. LAYMAN's technique to the Google memo. For example, as you are reading it, sure, you could jump in and tear apart every single word of every single sentence and get completely absorbed in what you think is James Damore's obviously wrong understanding of the gender wage gap mentioned as a myth in this document. Or you could take a deep breath, apply benevolent reading, understand that some of the details of his work are a result of different interpretation of a concept, and instead focus on getting the strongest possible argument for different distributions of biological and psychological traits being one of the many factors in the different life choices men and women make. Oh, and that last part, by the way, yeah, that's the main argument of the Google memo. There's nothing in it about the performance or abilities of women who choose to get into computer engineering. Now, I also think it would be helpful if, as you are going through the document, click on the sources James Damore cites as evidence for his claims, especially if you disagree with his premises. This is another important step to counter your bias as suggested by Dr. LAYMAN.
Similar to benevolent reading, but still a bit different, is counter-research. This is especially useful if you already have a strong preconceived idea of how things are supposed to work. For example, if you are convinced that guns directly cause crime, when doing counter-research, you'd specifically focus on papers that go directly against what you think is true. Not only do you try to construct the strongest possible point against your worldview, but you also actively try to argue against your worldview. Basically, you would be looking for the strongest papers you can possibly find that suggest that guns do not directly cause crime.
Again, let's apply this to James Damore's work. If you are convinced all men and women are a blank slate when they are born and all later life choices are only cultivated by socialization, when doing counter-research, you would specifically focus on papers that go directly against what you think is true. Not only do you try to construct the strongest possible point against your worldview, but you also actively try to argue against your worldview. Basically, you'd be looking for the strongest papers you could possibly find that suggest that blank slate socialization is not the only factor in men's and women's later life choices. Now for this, finding research is easy because Damore does provide links to all his sources. So if your bias is to disagree with Damore, using his sources can be the start of your counter research. But what if you're one of the people who already agrees with what you think Damore is saying? Well, I still suggest you do this counter research step if you're really interested in this. Now, I know this sounds like a lot more work than you would do for a silly little controversy that you don't think affects your life, but I still highly encourage everybody to get out of their own little echo chamber. There is a fantastic article that I've linked below from HETERODOX Academy that I think everybody, pro and con, should read, and it provides more research than any non-academic could ever ask for, especially me, because I'm not an academic, but I find the entire discussion completely fascinating. The article is called The Google Memo: What Does the Research Say About Gender Differences? And what they do is they analyze various commentary from several academics that generally are supportive of James Damore's work, and also from several academics that are generally critical of it, and all these academics have backed up their arguments with research. Then they also provide what is known as a meta-analysis, which is a method of examining effects found or not found in dozens or even hundreds of studies. They convert the effect sizes to a common scale and then finding the average across all the studies. So basically they are analyzing dozens and dozens of pieces of academic research that both support and oppose claims made in the Google Memo, and they combine it into one article. And as you read the article, they will show the findings that generally support Damore's claims in green and findings that generally oppose his claims or support his critics in red. And as you go through it, there is red and green all over the place. I think they do a fantastic job of eliminating bias in evaluating Damore's claims and providing the most extensive analysis of his work. Plus, it will save you a lot of time trying to research this very challenging subject because all of this competing research can be found in one place. I think it's awesome. Oh yeah, and there's a couple other cool things about this HETERODOX Academy article. First, members of the Academy, which includes only credentialed academics and graduate students, can write comments on the article that often include new or updated research. And when they do, the main authors will constantly update the article with any new information. So the comment section is just brilliant. It's almost as fun to read as the article itself, but vastly more relevant than the comment section of your average YouTube video. And then the other thing that I like is if you really want to go deep into this topic, the article links two supplemental articles. One called The Most Authoritative Review Paper on Gender Differences, and another called The Greater Male Variability Hypothesis. But honestly, save those for later. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here because this video is already way longer than I planned. I'm going to do at least a couple more videos about this subject. One will be based on some of the conversations I've had since the memo came out, and then at least one more where I'll go through the memo itself and give you some thoughts about what it actually means versus how some people interpret it. So take the challenge. Read the memo, and when you're done, I'd really like to hear your thoughts and experiences with this subject in the comment section down below. What have your conversations been like? What do you think Damore's purpose for writing this memo was? Have you watched any of his interviews, and what do you think of those? Did reading the actual memo for the first time or again change your perspective on what the memo is about? Or do you just think I'm a terrible person for bringing this all up again? Hey, whatever you want to say, I'd love to hear it down below. Also, could you do me a huge favor? Whether you agree with me or not, Being that I'm a very small YouTube channel, it would be very helpful if you would share this video with at least 2 people or on 2 social media platforms. I'd really like to see a variety of opinions on this subject in the comments. It makes for a much better conversation than just everybody agreeing with me. So really, seriously, if you like it, rah rah, praise P-Dog, hit that like button, subscribe, and all that stuff. But if you hated it, fine, hit the dislike, let me have it. Tell me why below and tell all your friends. Bring it on, Bubba, I ain't scared. But regardless, whether you liked or hated it, thank you so much for watching. I'm P-Dog Knight, and I'm out of here.